Hello, in this video, we're going to be talking about the bones. So let's not waste any of your time. Let's get right to it. Now, when we're talking bones, the first thing we want to think about is the different sections. And the sections that we're going to talk about during this unit, and they'll each have their own videos, and in some cases, like the skull, a couple of videos, because there's just so much. If you looked at this list and made a list of the sections based on how many bones you thought they might have, the skull might be towards the bottom of the list as far as thinking it might have the least amount, but actually it has the most amount. You would think that the skull was just one, kind of one bone throughout, but it's actually not. It's a combination of multiple bones, either fused together with sutures or some sort of connection point. So it actually has quite a bit when you consider the mandibles, the jaws, and everything. And it's like the United States. It's not just one continuous landform on a map. It is in real life, obviously, but not on a map. In the map, we've got the 50 states, each its own little section. And if you see a color-coded version of all those states, like we're going to see with the skull, you kind of see the same thing. Just a lot of sections that make up the entire whole thing. But we're also going to look at the two girdles, the pectoral girdle and the pelvic girdle. The pelvic girdle's easy to understand. It's the pelvic bones that the top of the body just kind of sets in, almost like a little cup. A shelf's not the right word because the shelves are flat, but the pectoral girdle is almost like a catcher's mitt, just kind of holding everything from above in there. And the pectoral girdle, if you were just thinking about it, you would think, okay, the sternum area, which kind of connects everything. That's not what it's referring to. The pectoral girdle is actually the part that connects the upper chest area with the upper limbs. So it's the scapula, the shoulder blade back here, and the clavicle here in the front that kind of connects those things to the upper limbs. Just like the pelvic girdle in the bottom is what connects the axillary area to the lower limbs. Then we'll also look at the thoracic cage, which is essentially the ribs, and of course then we'll also look at the vertebrae as well. So we'll look at all those sections individually, and as I mentioned, a few of them have two videos just because there's so much to talk about. Okay, the next thing we want to think about is just kind of an overall classification of the bone. There's essentially two sections: the axial skeleton, which is kind of wrapped around that center axis. If we just took our skeleton system or skeleton structure and just kind of made an axis down the middle, everything on that is the axial skeleton. So, as you can see there from the list, the vertebrae, the skull sits on top of it, the thoracic cage that wraps around our abdominal cavity. Those are things that are considered part of the axial skeleton. The appendicular is essentially everything else that's not directly connected to the axle or the axial skeleton or to the vertebrae. And that would be, the upper and lower limbs, the pectoral girdle, the pelvic girdle, as I mentioned, and the lower limbs as well. The pelvic girdle, you might say, well, that's connected to the vertebrae, isn't it? Well, and technically it's not. It's touching something that's touching the vertebrae, but you got the sacrum in between there that kind of separates the vertebrae from that particular area. So that's the two main areas that we'll be dealing with, and of course those are potential multiple choice questions on a test. Which of these isn't or is part of the axial skeleton? Which of these is or isn't part of the appendicular skeleton? All right, the next thing we want to consider is just overall information about the bones. As you can see there, adults typically have 206, and you may think that each adult would have the same number of bones, and that would be a logical thought to have, but it isn't. There are some things that happen that create variations in the number of bones. Sometimes tendons, if they are used in a particular manner, they have a lot of stress, and the cartilage and other factors, some bones will develop in those as a way to kind of strengthen, or maybe sometimes it's just as part of the repair process. So you can get some bones in there. Not everybody bones fuse together as they would like to do completely all the time, so there's some variations in there, and along the suture lines as well, as you can read there. Sometimes those don't finish or complete like they're designed to do, and you can have extra bones. Nobody grows extra bones. Nobody has like a typical evolutionary kind of thought, like, okay, I do this job, so I need more bones here, or I need more bones there. No, that doesn't happen. It's more about the development process and how it may or may not complete as it's intended to. And you can see there that we start off with 270 bones at birth, and just over time, bones fuse together. The skull has a lot of those that fuse together to become one, and we'll cover all those in each individual section. Okay, so this is a reference to the axial and the appendicular that we spoke about a few minutes ago, and these are color coded, and the color coding words on the far right, the tan color of the word tan that you can see over there isn't exactly like the picture. It's more of the beige that you would see as a skeleton, so the color is not exactly right, but it is basically, it's green, and in the other areas are the axial skeleton. So you can kind of see there that it's the upper limbs certainly, and in that scapula clavicle area, and then the pelvic girdle in the bottom or at the halfway, and in the lower limbs. So essentially you could think that the appendicular has the upper and lower limbs, and the pelvic and the pectoral girdle, those four things. If you were looking for words on a multiple choice test question, you could think that. And then of course, if you were looking at the axial, you would certainly think skull, and then you would think vertebrae, and then you would think thoracic cage. For the most part, you get a complete list of those. And next on our list, which is also our last thing to go over, and again, the picture is kind of small, or I should say this picture is kind of small, but it is in your book to look at as well. And as we talk about the individual parts, we'll reference these, and some of these, when we get to looking at them as examples, they're kind of similar, and so you may be interested to know what differences, what makes them a different things. Like one would think that, hey, an empty space is an empty space. Why do they have different names? And a lot of it is when we see a skull, just a skull, and for the most part, it's just going to be a plastic made version of a skull. We might see a cavity and there's nothing in it, or you might see I just lost my thought there, or an orbit, and there's nothing there, and so you may think, okay, it's just an empty hole. the way to think of cavities and orbits, as far as a difference, you could think of a cave. Okay, a cave, the entrance to a cave, that, if it's, whether it's the arch, typical arch that you would walk into, that would be an orbit. It's that entryway into an open area, the structure that makes that opening, and the way to think about that is your eye socket. Okay, your eye socket, that bone around the opening, that's the orbit. So the orbit isn't really an empty space. The orbit is what's around it. Or the orbit, I should say, is an empty space caused by the structure that's around it. So the orbit would be like the mouth of the cave. You walk into it a few steps, and now you're into the cavity, the big open area of the cave. And of course, it's going to be lined with rock, just like your skull would be lined with bone. But the empty space, the big empty space, would be the cavity. The space created by or separated by the entrance or the opening, that would be the orbit. So other things that are kind of similar, things like processes, and then heads. And again, the picture's kind of small, but the grayish blue area on the long femur over there, that's considered a head. And but also you can see the scapula there, the pointy thing that would sit into the socket in your arm. That's called a process. And you may think, well, they kind of do the same thing. The process allows the scapula to move around. The head on the femur or the humerus allows it to move around. But the slight difference is how they sit in things. Processes just touch, or just maybe not. They're not actually touching because they're going to have tendons and cartilage in between. But it's just touching. The process would just touch. It's not really designed. It's not what causes the actual movement. What actually causes the ability to move around is the fact that it's not a hardened contact with the bone, but it's the muscles that allow that. Whereas the head actually sets into a socket, and part of the socket is smaller than the actual head. And so, like your shoulder, when somebody pops out their shoulder and it has to be pushed back in, the pain is from the fact that the head of it is just kind of almost slightly bigger, and that's why you see those, like the Lethal Weapon movies, where by kind of slamming it into something, because it really takes a lot of force to kind of push it back into that process. Or occasionally you can see it, not so much anymore with the more improved shoulder pads, but occasionally we used to see it 70s and 80s in a football game where that would happen. Somebody take a shoulder right to a helmet right to the shoulder and like pop it out, and they got to pop it back into place. And so it's just slightly bigger. So that's kind of the little difference between those. And something else you might see that you would think, okay, that's kind of the same, but a condyle, a spine, those things are can look kind of similar. A spike as well, but the difference is a condyle is something that kind of sets into something, and a spike is more for to secure it or to give it some structure. But a condyle will sit into something so it can either rock or something like that. So it's more rounded. It has a point. It does kind of come to a point. But a spike is a true spike, just like you might think about as a spine or a splinter, not a splinter, a sticker or something, just a true actual point. But that's just some kind of the general terms and how they might differ from each other. Well, that's our video over bones, kind of the general information. When we come back together, or when we see you next time, we'll be talking about the skull. Until then, we'll say goodbye.